Hey guys, tonight we begin with a city that looks like it was designed by a drunk architect. Venice. A city that shouldn't exist, but somehow does, floating like an elegant accident that's been holding itself together for 1,500 years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before Venice became a floating jewel of art and architecture, it was just a swamp so unpleasant even mosquitoes needed therapy afterward. Imagine endless marshes, saltwater puddles and mud that could eat your sandals. That was the Venetian lagoon. The only thing it had going for it was that no one else wanted it. Back in the days of ancient Rome, this region was less La Serenissima and more La Swampissima. The empire that built aqueducts across mountains and bathhouses heated by science looked at this soggy mess and said, "Nope." You can picture a Roman surveyor standing ankle-deep in muck, sketching for a minute, then quietly tearing up the papyrus and going home early. Still, the Romans being Romans, they couldn't leave it completely alone. They built a few fishing posts and docks around the edges, mostly for the glory of trade and the occasional tax collection. But even they knew this wasn't the place for grand monuments. You can't exactly build a Colosseum when your foundation jiggles like pudding. They called the area Venice, plural, because there were multiple little islands, and probably multiple bad decisions involved in living on them. The locals were fishermen, salt collectors, and people who had apparently lost a bet with the gods. The lagoon offered protection, yes, but also ankle-deep misery for eternity. For centuries, the place just sat there, half land, half water, all damp. Rome ignored it, historians ignored it, even invaders ignored it. Nobody wanted to sack a place that already looked half-sacked. Then, in the 5th century, when the Roman Empire finally collapsed like an overcooked lasagna, barbarians swept through Italy, burning cities to the ground. The survivors looked around and thought, where can we go that no sane person would follow? And someone pointed to the lagoon. Problem solved. So they waded in, built huts on stilts, and told themselves it was temporary, the way every bad decision starts. They had no idea they were founding a city that would one day outlast empires. Rome's marble cracked. Its temples fell. Its emperors faded into myth. But the swamp? The swamp endured. Venice was born not out of ambition or destiny, but pure waterlogged stubbornness. The Roman Empire finally collapsed, spectacularly, like a marble building that forgot about gravity. Barbarians stormed Italy, burning cities, looting churches, and giving historians something to write about for the next 1,500 years. For the survivors, there were two options: stay and die heroically, or leave and live soggily. Most chose the second. They fled north, into the marshy Venetian lagoon, a landscape so bleak it made exile look like a spa day. It was here that refugees from cities like Padua, Aquileia, and Altinum stumbled through waist-deep mud, and collectively decided, fine, we live here now. That's how Venice started, as a group of desperate people hiding from civilization on an island that didn't want them either. There was no solid ground, no farmland, and definitely no plan. These were city dwellers trying to survive in a floating compost heap. The first Venetian homes were rickety wooden huts balanced on planks, supported by logs jammed into the mud. If the tide rose too high, your living room simply became a small indoor lake. You can imagine the early meetings. Should we leave? No, the barbarians are still out there. Should we build somewhere drier? No, that would make sense. So they stayed, hammering tree trunks into the lagoon one by one, turning a swamp into a forest you couldn't walk through. They didn't know it yet, but they were creating the foundations for one of history's strangest cities. The wood came from far away, oak, alder, and larch from alpine forests, dragged by boat down rivers and across trade routes. Each log was a promise that maybe, just maybe, this place wouldn't sink before lunch. They piled thousands of them together, layer after layer, until the ground stopped squishing. That's how Venice began, as a refugee camp that accidentally discovered civil engineering. The early Venetians weren't thinkers or architects. They were survivors with hammers. They didn't care about beauty. They cared about not drowning. But as centuries passed, those soggy platforms hardened, the logs petrified, and the impossible city began to take shape. Venice was never planned. It was improvised, the longest-running temporary solution in world history. And somehow, it held. By the 6th century, the refugees had officially gone from temporary squatters to unintentionally founding a civilization. They now faced the small problem of living on top of liquid mud. You can't just build cities on slime, at least, not unless you're Venetian and dangerously optimistic. The lagoon floor was a mess. Soft clay, shifting silt, and water that liked to rearrange everything twice a day. Most people would have moved. Venice said, "Let's double down." They began hammering millions of wooden piles deep into the seabed. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred. Millions. Each one had to be driven down by hand, with mallets the size of small trees. It was less construction and more collective punishment. But it worked. Beneath every Venetian building lies a forest, a hidden empire of timber, driven into the earth and preserved by the oxygenless water. That's the secret. The wood doesn't rot. It turns to stone, mineralized by centuries of salt and pressure. Every palace, every tower, every cafe where tourists now pay €14 for a cappuccino, all balanced on ancient underwater lumber that refuses to die. Venice is literally built on dead trees and denial. Then came the second layer, Istrian limestone, hauled from across the Adriatic. This stone was so dense it laughed in the face of salt water. The Venetians laid it over the piles to form platforms, slabs of solid ground floating above chaos. It was the medieval version of building an apartment complex on a Jenga tower and hoping for the best. But it worked, again. Against every law of common sense and hydrology, buildings began to rise. Churches, warehouses, and homes stacked themselves over this improbable foundation. The skyline shimmered with possibility and mild insanity. The real miracle wasn't divine, it was logistical. Imagine organizing supply lines to feed, clothe, and shelter a growing city, on islands, in water, with no land, no roads, and no patience. Every nail, every stone, every beam had to arrive by boat. It was urban planning in slow motion. And yet, somehow, Venice didn't sink. It just settled. Gracefully. Like an old nobleman refusing to admit he's had too much wine. Even though the Roman Empire had packed up and collapsed centuries earlier, it refused to leave Venice alone. Rome was like that one ex who still influences your decisions long after the breakup, haunting your infrastructure, your design choices, and occasionally, your plumbing. The early Venetians, now ankle-deep in lagoon life, were technically living among the ruins of the empire. When the mainland cities fell, they stripped the remains clean. Old Roman bricks, columns, and marble were loaded onto barges and ferried into the swamp. Nothing says fresh start, quite like rebuilding your city with someone else's leftovers. Venice became a Frankenstein's monster of Roman recycling. Every pillar, arch, and statue came from somewhere else, a travelling circus of stolen architecture. The people who couldn't keep Rome alive on land somehow resurrected it on water. And the irony? The bits of Rome they salvaged would outlast the actual Rome. They also borrowed the empire's favourite engineering trick, arches. The Romans loved arches because they could hold up half the planet with geometry and confidence. The Venetians took that idea and ran with it, or rather, paddled with it. They used arches everywhere, to span canals, reinforce walls, and support buildings that really should have collapsed centuries ago. Of course, adapting Roman architecture to a lagoon was a nightmare. You can't exactly pour concrete when your floor moves twice a day. The solution? Hydraulic improvisation. The Venetians used lime, volcanic ash, and crushed stone to create a cement that hardened underwater. Basically, Roman concrete's damp, emotionally unstable cousin. As Venice grew, it began to look like a reflection of Rome, except shinier, smaller, and with more boats. There were basilicas, forums, and squares, all built atop soggy timber and borrowed genius. Rome's grandeur, reimagined by people who were just trying not to drown. That's the real magic of early Venice. It didn't invent new engineering. It just repurposed Rome's, with better waterproofing. Where Rome conquered continents, Venice conquered buoyancy. So even as the empire faded into dust, its spirit lingered in the lagoon, carved into every column and encoded in every bridge. Rome built on rock, Venice built on faith, wood, and a complete misunderstanding of how water works. By the 8th century, the swamp had somehow become a skyline. The impossible had organized itself into neighborhoods, canals, and half-sane street plans. Venice, the accidental city, had officially taken shape. Nobody planned it. It simply happened, the way mold happens when you ignore it long enough. Clusters of muddy huts evolved into villages, villages fused into islands, and islands were stitched together by bridges and trade routes. The whole thing looked less like an architectural plan and more like a coral reef, built slowly, organically, and in defiance of logic. Venice didn't rise, it accumulated. The population exploded. Fishermen became merchants, refugees became aristocrats, and the lagoon, once a hiding place for scared Romans, turned into a floating empire run by people who had absolutely no intention of touching dry land ever again. The Venetians weren't landowners, they were waterlords. Of course, the engineering nightmare never ended. The mud still shifted, the wood still creaked, and the sea still tried to repossess the property every few years. But Venetians, being professionally stubborn, simply adapted. They built more piles, more platforms, and more prayers. Churches were raised on wooden foundations so dense they could support marble domes without collapsing, at least on weekdays. The early canals became highways. Boats ferried goods, people, gossip, and the occasional corpse from one end of the lagoon to the other. It was urban flow management before traffic lights, and it only worked because everyone was equally lost. Venice also developed its own peculiar logic of survival. Since water surrounded everything, why build walls? The sea was the wall. Invaders couldn't reach them without drowning or getting distracted by seafood. The lagoon was both moat and miracle, a natural defence system built entirely out of inconvenience. By the year 800, the city had elected its first doge, essentially a glorified mayor in a fancy hat, and declared itself independent from both empires and reality. Venice had arrived, a city of salt and strategy, wood and wealth, that somehow managed to exist between two elements, land and water, chaos and civilization. And all it took was centuries of backbreaking labour, unending anxiety, and blind confidence in timber. By the 9th century, Venice had gone from muddy refugee camp to thriving aquatic tax haven. The swamp dwellers had evolved into merchants, sailors, and politicians who looked at water and saw opportunity, and probably a few unpaid docking fees. Venice wasn't built on land, so it didn't behave like a land city. It didn't have walls, farms, or horses. It had gondolas, sailors, and people who could balance on boats better than they could walk. It was a city designed by fish, for people who refused to drown. The lagoon that once kept invaders out became a gateway to the world. The Venetians turned their swamp into a naval empire, building ships faster than other nations could sink them. Their fleets connected Constantinople, Egypt, and the rest of Europe, trading everything from spices to silk to mild political corruption. Every dockyard was an orchestra of chaos, hammers pounding, ropes snapping, sailors yelling, and someone inevitably falling in. The Venetians became masters of maritime engineering, designing lightweight, fast ships that could outrun pirates and outmaneuver rivals. These weren't just traders. They were weaponized accountants with sails, and the city itself was booming. not figuratively, but audibly. Construction never stopped. Palaces grew out of the lagoon like coral reefs covered in marble. Every family that made money immediately tried to prove it by building a house slightly taller, shinier, or more impractical than their neighbours. If your home didn't threaten to collapse under its own luxury, were you even Venetian? The economy was booming too, mostly because Venice invented capitalism while pretending it was civic duty. The Doge ruled with elegance, the merchants ruled with ledgers, and the commoners ruled with gossip. Together, they created a government so complicated it made Rome look like a lemonade stand. Venice had no natural resources, no farmland, and no army. Just ships, ambition, and saltwater confidence. Somehow, that was enough. By the 11th century, Venice wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The swamp people had become the water people, the middlemen of the medieval world. They didn't conquer land, they conquered logistics. And that, in the Middle Ages, was far more profitable. If you ever visit Venice and wonder why there are no streets, the answer is simple. They tried, and the streets sank. The city quickly realized that in a place where the ground behaves like pudding, wheels were useless. So they chose boats. Boats don't mind floods, and they don't need paving. A win-win for any civilization founded on mud. Thus, Venice reinvented urban planning. While the rest of Europe was arguing over cobblestones, the Venetians dug channels. Every neighbourhood was built around water routes like veins in a living creature. The canals weren't decoration. They were roads, sewers, and occasionally bathtubs. It wasn't elegant at first. Early canals were basically ditches filled with regret. But the Venetians, being stubborn perfectionists, dredged and reshaped them until the lagoon became an aquatic grid system. They lined the edges with stone embankments, turning marshy chaos into navigable beauty. What started as survival engineering became urban poetry. And so, the gondola was born, sleek, quiet, and just narrow enough to fit through alleys that double as rivers. Each one was handcrafted and asymmetrical to compensate for the rower's single oar. It was the medieval equivalent of a luxury sports car, except it smelled faintly of salt and existential dread. Life flowed with the tides. Deliveries came by boat, funerals by boat, weddings by boat. Even arguments were conducted mid-canal, with shouting gondoliers throwing insults instead of punches. Venice became a city where people didn't walk. They glided. Of course, this also meant you couldn't casually leave your house without risking a swim. A single wrong step and you were part of the fish ecosystem. Children learned to row before they learned to run. And yet, somehow, it all worked. The canals became Venice's identity. While other medieval cities were choking on smoke and mud, Venice shimmered, clean, reflective, and slightly smug about it. The water that once threatened to drown them now carried their wealth, their art, and their attitude. Venice had done the impossible. It built civilization not on top of nature, but with it, a partnership between human madness and tidal patience. It wasn't just a city anymore. It was a floating experiment in controlled chaos. By the 12th century, Venice had stopped pretending to be humble. The city that once hid from barbarians was now flaunting marble palaces and bell towers, all standing miraculously on water. It was as if the Venetians looked at the laws of physics and said, "We hear you." We just don't care Venetian architecture was born from defiance, not of enemies, but of gravity. The builders knew their foundations were wooden stilts jammed into sludge, yet they decided to pile several tons of limestone and marble on top anyway. It's the kind of optimism that could only come from a people who live in denial every high tide. Each building was a gamble. The Doge's Palace, the Basilica di San Marco, the endless row of palazzi along the Grand Canal, all of them testaments to human ego and good waterproofing. Every facade sparkled with Byzantine mosaics, Gothic arches, and enough ornamentation to make Rome jealous. The result? A skyline so delicate it looks like it's about to fall over, but refuses to out of spite. To outsiders, Venice seemed enchanted. To locals, it was just stressful. The weight of all that beauty was literally dragging the city down. A slow-motion collapse they called subsidence, or as modern engineers put it, "We told you so." But Venetians didn't stop. They doubled down on their floating empire, layering palaces like pancakes and carving windows shaped like dreams. Architects obsessed over light, how it bounced off canals, reflected off marble, and blinded visiting diplomats just enough to make them sign bad trade deals. Everything in Venice was designed to impress. Churches that shimmered at dawn, bridges that arched with impossible grace, and squares paved like chessboards for the wealthy to stroll across, pretending they weren't standing on a glorified raft. It wasn't practicality, it was theatre. Venice wasn't built to survive, it was built to perform. Every brick, every statue, every mirrored ripple of water declared the same thing. Yes, this is insane. And yes, it's working. While the rest of Europe built castles on hills, Venice built palaces on water. Because if you're going to risk everything on a swamp, you might as well make it look fabulous. For all its beauty, Venice has always lived in an abusive relationship with the sea. The lagoon giveth, the lagoon taketh away, usually while flooding your living room. The same water that carried Venice's trade, reflected its palaces, and kept barbarians away also quietly ate the city from below, molecule by molecule. Salt water is nature's slowest, pettiest assassin. It seeps into brick, corrodes stone, and leaves behind a crust of glittering ruin. Every day, the tide licked the city's foundations like a cat testing its prey, waiting for the moment gravity would give up. The Venetians called it aqua alta, high water, but really it was just the sea reminding them who was boss. To survive, the Venetians became obsessive maintainers, the medieval version of people who vacuum before guests arrive, except their guests were floods. They scraped barnacles, replaced rotting piles, patched cracks with lime and prayers. The city employed entire crews whose full-time job was arguing with the ocean. Stone was the worst victim. The famous Istrian limestone, chosen for its toughness, could resist salt longer than most marriages, but even it surrendered eventually. The lower walls of buildings began to crumble, turning palaces into salt-lick sculptures. Residents adapted by moving their furniture upstairs, not because of feng shui, but because downstairs had become part of the lagoon. Venetians didn't panic. They innovated. They built water barriers, raised thresholds, and installed secret floodgates in churches that were supposed to symbolize humility. They became masters of denial, literally. If the water rose, they just pretended the city had a second floor. And yet, in the quiet hours after a storm, when the moonlight shimmered on the flooded piazzas, Venice looked ethereal, beautiful because it was fragile, proud because it was doomed. The saltwater enemy was relentless, but so were the Venetians. Their battle wasn't about victory. It was about endurance, a centuries-long standoff between architecture and chemistry. Most cities die of conquest, plague, or neglect. Venice is being gently dissolved by the same element that made it rich. And the people? They still sip espresso while their floors glisten underwater, muttering the city's unofficial motto, "It could be worse. At least it's not raining." By the 13th century, Venice wasn't just a city anymore. It was an empire on training wheels. While everyone else in Europe was stabbing each other for farmland, Venice was busy writing laws, counting money, and pretending wood doesn't sink. Somehow, this floating experiment had turned into a functioning republic. The government of Venice was a bureaucratic masterpiece, part democracy, part aristocracy, part group therapy session. At the top sat the Doge, elected for life but mostly trapped in ceremonies and elaborate hats. Beneath him were councils, committees, subcommittees, and the Council of Ten, which sounds like a band but was actually the most feared political machine in Europe. It handled espionage, corruption, and the occasional mysterious disappearance, all in writing, of course. Running a republic on stilts came with unique challenges. There were no city walls, no farmlands, and not much solid ground to store secrets. So Venice became obsessed with paper. Contracts, treaties, maritime codes, all neatly archived, while the floorboards creaked beneath them. Diplomats described the city as a masterpiece of order built entirely on chaos. They weren't wrong. Venetian politics ran on two things: trade and paranoia. The city's power depended on the sea, and the sea was unpredictable, just like its rivals. Every citizen was part merchant, part spy. Information moved faster than ships, and gossip was currency. You didn't just sell silk or salt, you sold intel. Venice basically invented LinkedIn, but wetter. Meanwhile, the economy flourished. The Arsenale, Venice's shipyard, could build a galley in a single day, centuries before mass production became a buzzword. Imagine an assembly line powered by hammers, rope, and loud opinions. Ships rolled out daily, carrying goods, soldiers, and sometimes questionable morals. And through it all, the city balanced, literally. The same creaking foundations that held palaces now held the machinery of government. Every decision, every law, every pile-driven compromise kept Venice afloat in more ways than one. The Republic of Venice wasn't born from ideology. It was born from logistics. It worked not because it was fair or moral, but because it was organized, ruthlessly, beautifully, and with just enough corruption to stay interesting. In short, Venice didn't rise through conquest. It rose through paperwork. By the 15th century, Venice had entered its Renaissance era, the golden age when art, money, and ego collided beautifully. The city was rich beyond reason, glittering with trade profits and moral flexibility. It had no land, no army, and no fresh water. But it did have painters, philosophers, and a collective belief that marble could fix anything. Venetian nobles began competing to see who could build the most beautiful house on the most unstable foundation. Yes, my palace leans slightly, one might say, but look at the reflection. The Grand Canal became an architectural catwalk where every facade screamed, "I'm wealthy, please notice before I collapse." This was also the age of Palladio, Titian, and Tintoretto, men who painted, built, and decorated as if the city weren't sinking beneath them. Churches glowed with mosaics made from crushed gemstones, and ceilings turned into oil-painted heavens. Venice became a masterpiece balancing on anxiety. Of course, all that beauty came with weight, literal tons of it. Each new palace pressed harder into the mud, forcing the city to sink faster. It was the Renaissance version of overdrafting your architectural credit card. Engineers begged for restraint, artists laughed and ordered more marble. Meanwhile, the lagoon began to exact its revenge. Salt crept into everything: walls, art, even people's shoes. The lower floors of buildings turned into amphibious habitats, and the city developed a new fashion trend: permanent dampness. Still, no one cared. Venice had become Europe's mirror, a city of light, reflection, and delightful denial. Visitors called it the Jewel of the Sea. Locals called it Tuesday. The whole place shimmered, floating somewhere between divine inspiration and structural failure. But even as the beauty reached perfection, something underneath was cracking. The trade routes were shifting, the Ottoman Empire was flexing, and the city's wealth was beginning to evaporate like mist. The Golden Age glittered because everyone was too polite to admit the tide was rising. Venice, in all her painted glory, had built her Renaissance on borrowed time and borrowed lumber. The city wasn't defying gravity anymore. It was negotiating with it, one tide at a time. Venice had a problem, and for once it wasn't flooding. It was logistics. By the 16th century, the Grand Canal had become the city's main artery, wide, majestic, and utterly inconvenient to cross. There were ferries, yes, but they were slow, wet, and smelled like wet democracy. The people demanded a bridge. Now, most cities would just build one and move on. Venice, however, debated the matter for decades, because every architect knew that putting a stone bridge across a moving body of water resting on mud was optimistic. But in true Venetian fashion, they decided to do it anyway. Elegantly and with maximum risk. Enter the Rialto Bridge, completed in 1591, the most beautiful engineering gamble in Renaissance Europe. It was a single-span stone arch stretching 24 metres across the Grand Canal, balanced perfectly on thousands of timber piles beneath. Critics said it would collapse immediately. Engineers said it was impossible. The Venetians said, "Hold my wine." They built it in 3 years. No scaffolding, no steel, no margin for error, just math, marble, and unreasonable confidence. When the bridge opened, people walked across it cautiously, waiting for disaster. But the thing refused to fall, as if gravity itself was too impressed to interfere. The Rialto became more than a bridge. It was a stage. Shops lined both sides, selling jewellery, silk, and probably overpriced souvenirs even then. It connected the city's two hearts, the market of San Polo and the grandeur of San Marco, in one sweeping gesture of arrogance and grace. Other cities built bridges to get somewhere. Venice built one to show off. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a flex post. Look at me. I'm standing on physics. And of course, it became an instant icon. Travellers marvelled at its impossible curve. Artists painted it obsessively, and locals used it as an excellent place to overhear gossip. The Rialto Bridge didn't just connect two sides of Venice. It connected centuries of madness into one arch of stone and ego. Even now, when tourists crowd its steps for selfies, they're standing on a 400-year-old reminder that human arrogance occasionally pays off. Usually, it sinks. But in Venice, it somehow floats. By the late Renaissance, Venice had become the world's most glamorous science experiment. The city wasn't just built near water. It was built with it, on it, and occasionally under it. Every tide, every storm, every full moon was a reminder that living here required equal parts faith and physics. So the Venetians became scientists, not the kind with lab coats, but the kind with damp boots and a deep distrust of gravity. They studied tides, salinity, and sediment flow centuries before anyone coined the word hydrology. They knew exactly how much silt the rivers brought in and how much the sea took out. Venice wasn't just surviving the lagoon, it was managing it like a high-maintenance relationship. The biggest problem was silt. Rivers dumped tons of it into the lagoon, threatening to turn Venice back into the swamp it started as. So, what did the Venetians do? They redirected the rivers, not metaphorically, literally. They dug new channels to send the Brenta and Piave rivers elsewhere, away from the lagoon. It was environmental manipulation on a godlike scale, carried out by men in tights. Of course, these projects were risky. Diverting rivers could easily flood nearby towns, but that wasn't Venice's problem. Those towns were on land, and therefore unimportant. Then came the floodgates. Wooden barriers designed to hold back the worst tides. They weren't perfect, but they gave the illusion of control, which is really all humanity has ever wanted from nature. Venetian engineers were basically the first to look at the ocean and say, "You work for me now." The city's obsession with balance became both its brilliance and its curse. Everything, tides, trade, architecture, even politics, was a delicate equation that had to be constantly adjusted. One wrong calculation, and you'd wake up owning a fish farm instead of a bedroom. But somehow, the system worked. The canals stayed open, the foundations held, and the city continued its improbable float through history. Venice didn't conquer the sea. It negotiated with it, politely, repeatedly, for 600 years. It was less an empire, and more a centuries-long maintenance plan, the most beautiful ongoing repair job in the world. By the 16th century, Venice had reached its theatrical peak, rich, radiant, and completely unaware that it was performing its own slow-motion tragedy. The city was a superstar entering its decadent phase, flawless on the surface, crumbling underneath. Trade was declining, empires were shifting, and the lagoon was turning from protector to predator. But denial was Venice's favourite art form. The merchants noticed fewer ships. The engineers noticed more floods. The nobles noticed nothing. They were too busy commissioning portraits of themselves pretending not to care. The truth was simple. Venice was sinking. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally. The wooden piles beneath the city were still strong, but the ground around them wasn't. The clay compressed. The water rose. The city began to settle lower each century, like a nobleman after too much wine. The symptoms were everywhere. Doors that once opened onto the street now opened into the canal. Lower floors became unusable, so Venetians simply moved upstairs and called it renovation. The city quietly adjusted its expectations. Engineers proposed solutions, raising the streets, building higher embankments, praying harder. Each one helped for a decade before the sea shrugged and came back stronger. Nature, it turned out, was not interested in architectural negotiation, but instead of despairing, Venice turned its decay into an aesthetic. Artists painted its soft light, its quiet melancholy, its shimmering reflections of ruin. Writers described it as a city caught between life and memory. In truth, it was caught between tides. Even the tourists, early ones dressed in lace and idealism, loved it more for its fragility. Venice became Europe's favourite dying beauty, tragic, glamorous, and slightly damp. Meanwhile, the Venetians carried on like professionals. The government still met, the gondoliers still argued, and the Doge still waved politely from balconies that were slowly sinking out of view. Venice wasn't collapsing overnight. It was rehearsing collapse indefinitely. A city too proud to die quickly. It was still rich, still beautiful, still ridiculous, just wetter. The engineers took notes, the poets wept, and the sea kept applauding. Because even drowning, Venice knew how to make it look graceful. 5 centuries later, Venice is still standing, or rather, hovering suspiciously close to not standing at all. The same wooden piles driven into mud 1,000 years ago are still there, holding up a Renaissance dream that refuses to admit it's mostly luck. It's a miracle of endurance and poor planning. The city never truly conquered nature. It just negotiated with it, daily, with the patience of a tired marriage. The sea rises, Venice adjusts. The salt eats, Venice repaints. Floods come, Venetians shrug and order espresso. Every inch of the city is an argument between human pride and the physics of water. Modern engineers call it subsidence. Locals call it Tuesday. The streets flood, the tourists panic, and the gondoliers carry on singing like this is fine. Because to them, it is. They've been living in a slow apocalypse for centuries. When you've seen entire empires vanish under the waves of history, a little high tide doesn't scare you. The real secret of Venice isn't its beauty. It's its refusal to die properly. It's too stubborn, too proud, too aware that the world is still watching. The city that began as a refugee camp in a swamp became a republic, an empire, an art gallery, and finally, a cautionary tale about building anything near water. And yet, it endures. Every bridge and canal is part of a choreography, a centuries-long balancing act between ambition and decay. The same marble that dazzled the Renaissance still glows at sunset, its reflection rippling in the canals like time itself laughing softly. The city may sink, but its image never does. Venice is not a monument. It's a performance, one that's been running for 1,500 years without intermission. The actors change, the water rises, the set warps a little, but the show goes on, and maybe that's the real lesson of Venice. You don't need to win against nature. You just need good lighting, excellent balance, and the confidence to keep pretending it's all under control. The rest is maintenance. High in the fog-drenched Alborz Mountains, where the wind whispered through stone and legend, a fortress named Alamut guarded more than walls. It guarded an idea. To the common folk, it was the eagle's nest, a citadel unreachable and unseen, ruled by men who spoke softly, yet made empires tremble. From here, Hassani Sabah, the enigmatic old man of the mountain, created not merely a sect, but a myth that would ripple across continents. The Hashashin, or Nizari Ismailis as they truly were, emerged in the 11th century. born from the fractures of Islam itself. Amidst the political chaos between Sunni Abbasids and Shia Fatimids, Hassan built something radical, a disciplined order bound not by blood, but by purpose. They pledged absolute loyalty to him, to the cause of divine knowledge, and to a dream of spiritual freedom that terrified kings and caliphs alike. Training was rigorous. Recruits lived like monks, studying philosophy, theology, and the art of infiltration. They didn't fight wars of armies, but wars of patience. To them, one blade in the right place could change the balance of nations. To their enemies, they were ghosts in white robes who struck from nowhere, left a message carved in fear, and vanished into mountain mist. But the name Hashashin, from which the modern word assassin descends, was a gift of propaganda. Enemies whispered that Hassan's followers were drugged with hashish before missions, that they saw paradise in hallucination, and thus feared no death. Marco Polo later carried that tale to Europe, claiming to have heard of gardens filled with houris and rivers of wine, where these killers believed they'd awaken after martyrdom. Truth, however, was far more sober, and far more frightening, for the real power of the Hashashin lay not in intoxication but in intellect. They infiltrated courts, brokered information, and turned assassination into strategy. When a caliph, crusader, or vizier woke to find a dagger planted beside his pillow, it was a warning, not a death sentence. "We could have killed you," the message said. "Next time, we will." From those mountain citadels, a network of fear and fascination spread. And though centuries would bury them, their name, half myth, half memory, would survive every empire that tried to erase it. Before the legend of daggers and gardens, there was a man, a scholar, strategist, and zealot, named Hassan-i-Sabah. Born in Qom, Persia, around 1050, Hassan grew up in a world of scholars and theologians, where faith and politics danced in constant tension. He was a prodigy, intelligent, austere, and utterly convinced that truth could be found only through reason guided by faith. He studied under the Fatimids in Cairo, absorbing the doctrines of the Ismaili sect. Yet even among fanatics, Hassan was exceptional. His brilliance earned him both respect and exile. The Fatimid caliph in Cairo, suspicious of Hassan's ambition, cast him out, a move that would, ironically, create his most dangerous enemy. Hassan fled east, moving like a phantom through Persia until he found his sanctuary, the fortress of Alamut, perched like a falcon's perch above the world. Through wit, persuasion, and possibly a touch of manipulation, he seized control of it in 1090 without spilling a drop of blood. The legend says he infiltrated the fortress disguised as a teacher, converting the garrison one man at a time until the castle itself bowed to him. Once inside, Hassan transformed Alamut into more than a fortress. It became a university, a monastery, and an intelligence hub all in one. Every disciple was carefully chosen and tested. The young men were taught theology, philosophy, and languages, but also disguise, stealth, and the anatomy of a perfect kill. He forbade indulgence, demanded silence, and preached that martyrdom was not death, but union with the divine. His men were so devoted that they would leap from towers at his command to prove their loyalty, an act that horrified outsiders and immortalized his authority. Hassan's leadership was not one of fear, but faith, weaponized. He ruled for 35 years without leaving Alamut once, directing operations through letters, coded messages, and whispers carried by loyal couriers. Assassinations under his command were surgical. Viziers, generals, even Seljuk princes fell by daggers guided by his ideology. To his enemies, Hassan was a madman cloaked in sanctity. To his followers, he was the proof that divine truth could be achieved through absolute discipline. In the shadowed chambers of Alamut, he became both prophet and puppeteer, the mind behind the myth that would one day terrify the entire medieval world. Inside the stone walls of Alamut, discipline was scripture. Hassan-i-Sabah's creed demanded more than faith. It required surrender of the self. The men who came to serve him were stripped of family ties, wealth, and identity. They emerged as feeders, those who sacrifice. To them, death was not punishment, but fulfillment. Hassan's genius lay in transforming belief into obedience so complete that even empires feared to whisper his name. Each initiate's training began not with weapons, but with silence. They learned to fast, to watch, to wait. They memorized texts from the Quran and from Ismaili philosophy until thought itself became a weapon. Only when their minds were sharpened were they taught the blade. Every motion was ritual, the drawing of the dagger, the strike, the retreat. Failure was not permitted. Those who hesitated never returned from their missions, and those who succeeded became living shadows. It wasn't brute strength that made the Hashashin dangerous. It was precision. Unlike the wild raids of crusaders or the massed armies of sultans, their strikes were personal, surgical, and theatrical. They did not kill for pleasure or loot. They killed to deliver messages. A single assassination might halt an invasion, end a feud, or reshape a dynasty's policy overnight. Hassan had created the first psychological warfare network long before the term existed, and yet their creed was not chaos. Hassan's assassins followed strict moral parameters. Their targets were chosen with deliberation, often men who had betrayed pacts, persecuted the Ismailis, or threatened their survival. To kill without purpose was forbidden. To die without conviction was shameful. In time, their methods inspired terror bordering on superstition. The dagger left on a pillow, the whisper in the dark, the rumour of a man smiling before death, all became signatures of the Hashashin. Even hardened generals would pray before sleeping, fearing that a servant or bodyguard might already be one of Hassan's own. To outsiders, they were fanatics. But within Alamut's halls, they saw themselves as soldiers of truth, men who believed that one act of sacrifice could purify a world poisoned by corruption. Their creed was simple yet absolute. The blade serves not hatred, but destiny. And in that, they found both purpose and peace. By the early 12th century, the name Hashashin had already begun to crawl through the corridors of power like a chill. The first confirmed assassinations were not random acts of terror, but strategic executions, carried out with almost theatrical precision. Hassani Saba's men didn't merely kill, they performed death. Each strike was both message and miracle, a demonstration of reach that mocked every fortress, guard and army on earth. Their first great target was Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier of the Seljuk Empire, a man whose influence stretched across Persia and Syria. In 1092, disguised as a wandering dervish, a lone feeder approached the vizier's litter under the pretext of presenting a petition. When the vizier unrolled the paper, the assassin plunged a dagger into his heart. The fida was instantly cut down by guards, but the message had been delivered. Even the mightiest minister was not beyond the mountain's grasp. News of the killing spread like wildfire, and with it came a kind of awe. The Hashashin had no armies, yet they wielded the power of fear more effectively than any legion. They operated with surgical intelligence, blending faith, politics, and theatre into one potent formula. Each mission was designed to echo, to whisper through the courts of sultans and crusader kings alike. Soon, assassination became diplomacy. Princes who once cursed Hassan's name began to send him tribute, desperate to buy safety. Rumours swirled that the Hashashin maintained spies in every royal court, that no oath or alliance was safe. Even crusaders in distant Jerusalem spoke of them in hushed tones, believing them to be invisible servants of death. But Hassan was not reckless. Each strike was chosen to maximize terror with minimal bloodshed. Killing one ruler could paralyze 10 armies. Leaving a warning dagger on a pillow could achieve more than a massacre. Hassan's true genius lay not in the act of murder, but in the threat of it. The result was paradoxical. Peace through fear. Villages near Alamut slept soundly, untouched by war, because everyone knew that crossing Hassan's path meant vanishing from history. It was controlled by myth, and Hassan was its invisible emperor, ruling the world from his eagle's nest with nothing but whispers and blades. When Marco Polo passed through the East 2 centuries later, he brought with him one of history's most enduring and misleading legends. He claimed that Hassani Sabah lured young men into his service using an earthly paradise, a secret garden filled with wine, women, and wonder. Drugged with hashish, the initiates would awaken in this artificial Eden, believing they had glimpsed the rewards of martyrdom. When they awoke again in Alamut, Hassan would tell them, "Serve me, and you shall return to paradise forever." It was a story made for medieval Europe, a tale of Eastern decadence and devilish cunning. But while it captured imaginations from Venice to Paris, the truth was less indulgent and far more intelligent. There is no record, in any Persian or Arabic source, of such a garden ever existing. The myth likely came from hostile chroniclers eager to portray the Ismailis as heretics, intoxicated by drugs and illusion. To the Sunni orthodoxy, calling them hashish users, hashashin, was a way to strip them of legitimacy, to turn a disciplined religious order into a pack of fanatics. Yet, as with all effective propaganda, there was a seed of psychological brilliance buried in the tale. Hassan did not need narcotics to inspire devotion. He had created his own paradise through belief. His fortress at Alamut was designed to simulate perfection. Fertile terraces, clear streams, libraries filled with books, halls that echoed with debate instead of drunkenness. In a sense, Hassan had indeed built Eden, not of sensual pleasure, but of intellectual and spiritual transcendence. Still, the myth of the hashish garden stuck, for it explained what outsiders could not comprehend. How men could walk unflinchingly into death with calm smiles and steady hands. To crusaders and chroniclers, it was easier to believe in drugged obedience than in spiritual conviction. And so, the name assassins, born from slander, would become their immortal brand. Hassan never corrected the rumour. He didn't need to. Let kings believe his men were demons. Let chroniclers think they were dreamers, high on paradise smoke. The more unbelievable the story, the greater its power. In that silence, the old man of the mountain understood the first rule of myth-making. The lie that terrifies is worth more than the truth that reassures. When the Crusaders stormed into the Holy Land in the late 11th century, they came expecting clear lines of loyalty, Christians on one side, Muslims on the other. What they found instead was a landscape of fractured allegiances, shifting alliances, and one mysterious faction that seemed to serve no one but themselves, the Hashashin. Neither holy friend nor foe, they were a paradox wrapped in shadow. At first the Crusaders dismissed them as mountain bandits, until bodies began to appear, bodies of men too powerful to fall so easily. The most infamous case was Conrad of Montferrat, king-elect of Jerusalem, murdered in 1192. Two assassins, disguised as monks, approached him as he walked through the narrow streets of Tyre. They greeted him respectfully, then drew daggers from beneath their robes and stabbed him before being cut down. To the Crusaders, this was an act of pure evil. To the Hashashin, it was business. The Templars and Hospitallers soon learned that the assassins could be both ally and enemy, depending on who paid the tribute. Richard the Lionheart is rumoured to have negotiated with them, while Saladin himself survived multiple assassination attempts. Once, after an unsuccessful attack, he reportedly awoke to find a dagger and note left on his pillow. "You are in our power." The message was not just a threat, it was a reminder that even the mighty Sultan was mortal. In their strange neutrality, the Hashashin became a political wildcard. They attacked both Christian and Muslim leaders, but never for faith, only for purpose. Some Crusader chroniclers even admired them, describing their courage and the eerie calm with which they faced death. Others, horrified, claimed they were demons who worshipped false gods in the mountains. Their influence extended beyond swords and politics. They introduced Europe to the idea of the invisible killer, the man who moves unseen, acts alone, and topples empires with one well-placed strike. In time, that idea would outlive the sect itself, shaping everything from medieval paranoia to modern espionage. To the Crusaders, the Hashashin were a mystery that defied the logic of chivalry. They fought without banners, prayed without priests, and killed without armies. A mirror held up to the arrogance of kings and knights who believed that power could only come from force. Alamut was more than a fortress. It was a statement carved in stone. Perched high in the Elburz Mountains, it seemed to defy the world below, a citadel built not just for war, but for thought. While Crusader castles bristled with towers and catapults, Alamut's greatest weapon was its library. Within its walls, Hassan-i-Sabbah gathered scholars, astronomers, and philosophers from across Persia and beyond, forging a sanctuary of intellect in an age of ignorance. The Hashashin were not mere killers, they were thinkers. At Alamut, science walked hand in hand with faith. Students studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the art of logic alongside theology and covert tactics. Some accounts describe vast archives of manuscripts where the works of Greek, Persian, and Arab thinkers were preserved. Hassan, despite being a man of iron discipline, believed that knowledge was the highest form of worship, and ignorance the greatest sin. Daily life inside Alamut was as strict as any monastery. Every moment had purpose. The feeders trained in silence, scholars debated the structure of the cosmos, and scribes copied precious texts by lamplight. The atmosphere was a paradox, austere yet alive, secretive yet curious. Outsiders imagined it as a den of heresy and hedonism, but inside it was more akin to a university run by ascetics. Hassan ruled with ruthless order. Even laughter was rare. Music and wine were forbidden. Discussion and study were compulsory. Yet through this rigidity, he achieved something astonishing. He turned assassins into philosophers, and philosophers into believers. The mind, he taught, was the sharpest dagger of all. When Mongol forces later sacked Alamut in 1256, they found no hidden garden of sin, only scrolls, instruments, and the charred remains of books the invaders couldn't comprehend. The Mongol chroniclers, puzzled, noted that the fortress of the assassins had more in common with a school than an army camp. From the outside, Alamut appeared a fortress of fanaticism. From within, it was a bastion of order and enlightenment. That contrast between the myth of madness and the reality of discipline is what made the Hashashin immortal in memory. Their fortress stood as both monastery and machine, shaping warriors who wielded faith and reason with equal precision, and who, even in silence, changed history. By the mid-13th century, the world had changed. The Mongols had thundered westward like a storm that devoured cities, kingdoms, and dynasties in its path. No wall was too high, no empire too sacred. When the Ilkhanate forces under Hulagu Khan turned their gaze toward the Elburz Mountains, the assassins faced a threat unlike any before, an enemy immune to fear. Daggers meant little to men who thought death an honor. At this time, the Nizari Ismaili leadership had passed far from Hassan-i-Sabbah's disciplined iron grip. His successors had softened, dabbling in diplomacy and comfort. Yet even weakened, the Hashashin were still a symbol of dread. Hulagu could not allow such a symbol to exist in his empire. In 1256, he began his campaign to eradicate them, fortress by fortress, mountain by mountain. The siege of Alamut was swift and merciless. Despite its legend, the stronghold could not withstand Mongol engineering and overwhelming numbers. Contemporary chroniclers described the sky darkening with arrows, the air filled with smoke and screams. After days of siege, the last Imam of Alamut, Rukn al-Din Khursha, surrendered. In an act that symbolized the death of an idea, the Mongols burned the fortress to ash, its libraries thrown into the valley below. Books on philosophy, science, and astronomy, centuries of thought, vanished in a single inferno. Some say Hulagu ordered the destruction as vengeance for an earlier assassination attempt on his kin. Others believe it was practical. He sought to erase the psychological terror the Hashashin had long cultivated. Either way, the eagle's nest was gone, and with it, the order's earthly power. But the legend would not die. Survivors scattered through Persia and Syria vanishing into small cells, adapting like ghosts. Some integrated with local Ismaili communities. Others continued as silent agents, preserving fragments of knowledge and ritual. The Mongols could raise fortresses but not myths, and the myth of the assassins was far more durable than any stone wall. As centuries passed, storytellers would remember them not as scholars or seekers, but as fanatics and killers who vanished with a curse on their lips. Yet beneath that distortion, the truth flickered like an ember, a brotherhood of faith, intellect and precision, consumed by fire but never forgotten. When Alamut's towers crumbled, one might have expected the name of the Hashashin to fade into dust with them. Yet, paradoxically, their destruction only amplified their legend. Crusaders returned to Europe whispering tales of an invisible order of killers who answered to no king, wielded faith as a weapon, and laughed in the face of death. In time, the story grew beyond fact, mutating into myth, and myth, as ever, proved indestructible. By the Renaissance, the assassins had become a cautionary tale for rulers. Machiavelli referenced them obliquely when discussing power through fear. Chroniclers, poets, and travellers reshaped the story to suit their own moral landscapes, some depicting them as satanic heretics, others as models of unflinching loyalty. The East knew them as philosophers turned warriors. The West saw them as drugged fanatics in a mountain cult. Both were wrong, and both were partly right. Even centuries later, the word assassin still carried the chill of the mountains. It entered every European tongue. Italian assassino, French assassin, English assassin. Its roots buried deep in misunderstanding. Yet from that misunderstanding bloomed fascination. Painters, playwrights, and eventually novelists found in them a symbol of rebellion against tyranny, of the individual's power to strike at the untouchable. In the modern era, the myth took on new life. From romantic Orientalism to modern fiction and film, the assassins were reborn as freedom fighters, visionaries, and even proto-revolutionaries. The video games and novels of the 21st century turned their creed into a philosophy of liberation. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. A phrase that, while apocryphal, perfectly captured how the world imagined them. Skeptical of authority, loyal only to an idea greater than kings. But beyond the legends and pop culture, something essential remains. The Hashashin represented more than daggers in the dark. They embodied the tension between intellect and fanaticism, knowledge and obedience, secrecy and revelation. Their story is not just about murder, but about meaning, how belief, when refined to its sharpest edge, can become both a weapon and a mirror. Today, the name assassin no longer belongs to Hassan's mountain disciples, but to the myth they left behind. A warning that ideas, once loosed into the world, cannot be conquered, not by fire, not by empire, and not even by time itself. The Silk Road began not with silk, but with hunger. Before jade, gold, and spices filled the caravans, the traders had to fill themselves. From China's ancient Chang'an to the bazaars of Persia, food was the first universal language, the one that kept merchants alive across deserts and mountains. Every grain of flour, every fig, every sip of water mattered more than any gem in a saddlebag. In the vast deserts of Central Asia, bread was both symbol and survival. It came in endless shapes. The Persian nani sangak baked on hot stones, the Central Asian lepeshka slapped against the inside of clay tandoors, and the chewy, rope-patterned Uyghur bread baked under sand and embers. Each loaf carried the mark of its region, and when traders met at dusty way stations, they shared bread before names. To break bread on the Silk Road was not just to eat, it was to declare peace, if only for a night. Dates and dried fruit followed the caravans like loyal companions. Their sweetness outlasted any journey. Camel drivers from Arabia packed figs and raisins wrapped in linen. Persian merchants carried pistachios and almonds, and Chinese envoys brought preserved apricots from the orchards of Turpan. In a world without refrigeration, nature's candy kept men alive and civilized. Around campfires, those simple ingredients were mixed into stews: lentils with goat, barley with onions, a pinch of salt traded for a jewel's worth. Water, however, was the real treasure. It was often flavoured with whatever was available: mint leaves, saffron, or a slice of lemon if fortune smiled. Tea, when available, was a ceremony in itself. The Chinese brewed it green and pure. The Persians perfumed it with rose. The nomads mixed it with yak butter and salt, turning it into liquid energy. As the sun fell over the dunes, the air filled with the scent of meat roasting on open flames. Mutton skewers sizzling beside pots of Persian stew or Mongolian soup thickened with barley. Merchants would sit cross-legged, sharing from one pot, arguing over trade routes and poetry. The Silk Road was never just a highway of goods. It was a table set across continents. Every meal, every shared crust, turned strangers into temporary kin. And long before empires traded ideas or religion, they traded flavour. If bread was the Silk Road's heartbeat, spices were its perfume, invisible yet unforgettable. Their aroma travelled farther than any caravan could. Long before merchants traded silk by the bale, they traded flavour by the handful. A single sack of cinnamon or pepper could buy a horse. A pouch of saffron was treated like treasure. On this road of dust and wind, spices were wealth that could fit in your palm. The journey began in India, where cardamom, turmeric, and black pepper were harvested under a burning sun. These spices travelled north with Persian traders and west with Arab merchants, eventually flavouring stews in Byzantium and soups in Xi'an. The Persians, masters of fragrance, blended saffron, cumin, and dried rose petals into rice dishes like pilaf, transforming humble grains into royal feasts. To them, scent and flavour were acts of worship, a prayer expressed through the nose and tongue. In China, spice was less about heat and more about harmony. Ginger, star anise, and cinnamon bark weren't meant to burn the palate, but to balance it. The Chinese philosophy of yin and yang extended into their food. Sweet balanced bitter, spice balanced salt. When Persian merchants arrived with sacks of pepper and Arab coffee beans, the Chinese responded with their own exotic gift: tea. What followed was the world's first exchange of taste and temperament. Caravanserais, those desert inns that dotted the Silk Road, became the crossroads of cuisines. Travellers from India might share lentil stew rich with turmeric next to a Mongol roasting lamb over an open flame, while a Persian trader ground cloves into wine. The air inside was thick with smoke, laughter, and the layered scent of distant lands. Spices didn't just change meals, they changed economies and empires. They made kings crave trade routes and sent explorers sailing into the unknown centuries later. But for the travellers of the Silk Road, they were something simpler: comfort. A pinch of cumin could make the cold mountains of Pamir feel a little closer to home. Every dish, every grain of salt and drop of oil told a story that no map could capture. On the Silk Road, spices didn't just flavour food, they flavoured civilization itself. Imagine the sun setting over a caravanserai, that roadside fortress where merchants, monks, and mercenaries met under one roof. The air hums with languages: Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Greek, and Chinese, all tangled together like smoke. Outside, camels groan and settle in the dust. Inside, fires flicker beneath iron pots. The Silk Road may have been a highway of commerce, but its true heart beat around these campfire feasts. Food was the one currency that everyone respected. A bowl of stew shared between strangers could erase borders. Persian cooks often led the kitchen, their craft admired from Samarkand to Aleppo. They simmered lamb and chickpeas with dried limes, garlic, and saffron, filling the night air with a golden aroma. Nomads contributed what they knew best: meat grilled on skewers, flavoured with only salt and smoke. Meanwhile, Chinese traders unwrapped dumplings, small doughy miracles stuffed with minced pork or vegetables, and steamed them in bamboo baskets balanced over coals. Each feast became a fusion of geography. A Greek merchant poured his dark wine into a shared cup. An Arab scholar ground coffee beans roasted over sand. A Mongol horseman, still in his riding boots, dipped flatbread into Persian abgusht stew and nodded in approval. None of them spoke the same language, yet everyone understood that silence during a meal meant respect. For travellers on the Silk Road, hospitality wasn't optional, it was survival. Refusing to feed a stranger was seen as both shameful and dangerous. Stories tell of caravans that rescued starving wanderers, only to discover, days later, that those same strangers were wealthy traders who repaid generosity tenfold. To share food was to share fortune, and amid the laughter and crackling fires, ideas began to travel. Recipes turned into roots of their own. Someone would taste a new spice and ask, "Where does this grow?" And that question alone could chart an empire's next expedition. As the fires dimmed and the stars returned, the last cups of tea were poured, sweetened with honey and dust. The travellers would rest shoulder to shoulder, full not only of food, but of stories. On the Silk Road, a meal wasn't an intermission between journeys. It was the journey. Long before spaghetti twirled its way into Italy, noodles were already winding through the mountains of Central Asia. On the Silk Road, flour was as valuable as silver, a soft white treasure that could become anything: bread, dumplings, noodles, or pancakes. Every civilization along the route took wheat and shaped it into something uniquely their own, until the road itself became a tapestry of dough. In China's Tang dynasty, noodle making was a celebrated art. Chefs would stretch dough into silk-thin strands, flicking them through the air with a rhythm that hypnotized onlookers. These noodles, boiled in clear broth with onions, ginger, and sometimes a sliver of lamb, were a warm comfort after days on the trail. As travellers carried this simple idea westward, it morphed. In the oases of Central Asia, the Uyghurs turned noodles into lagman, thicker and hand-pulled, bathed in chili oil and lamb sauce. Farther west, Persians rolled dough into ribbons that would one day inspire the Italians' pasta fresca. Dumplings were the real miracle of portability, a meal wrapped inside its own protection. Chinese traders brought jiaozi and baozi. Turkic and Persian cooks reimagined them as manti, steamed, stuffed with spiced meat, and drizzled with yogurt and garlic. Each culture added its own accent, but the concept was the same: a self-contained world of flavour that could survive the cold, the dust, and the endless road. Flour became the great unifier, the ingredient that ignored borders. Even the Mongols, whose diet leaned heavily toward meat and milk, learned to cherish dumplings as their empire expanded into China and Persia. Soldiers could boil them in helmets or cook them on flat stones beside the fire. Efficiency and taste in one bite. At caravan stops, the smell of boiling dough mixed with that of roasting lamb and tea leaves. It wasn't just sustenance, it was civilization condensed into a bowl. Every dumpling, every noodle strand carried a lineage of hands that had kneaded, folded, and stretched it across thousands of miles. If silk was the thread that connected east and west, then dough was the glue that held their hearts together. On the Silk Road, a single bite of warm bread or soft noodle was proof that even in a world divided by mountains and empires, hunger spoke one universal language. If the Silk Road had a signature aroma, it would be the slow-simmered perfume of Persian stew, saffron, lamb, and dried lime rising together like a hymn. For weary travellers, these stews were the taste of civilization in a world of sand and stone. Wherever a Persian cook set up a pot, the desert briefly became a dining hall. Persian cuisine had always been about balance: sweet meeting sour, spice meeting restraint. Dishes like koreşte fesincan, made from pomegranate molasses and ground walnuts, dazzled anyone lucky enough to taste it. It was thick, tangy, and jewel-coloured, often served with rice perfumed by saffron threads worth their weight in gold. Other favourites included abgusht, a hearty stew of lamb, chickpeas and onions, boiled in clay pots that could be sealed for travel. Caravanners loved it because it aged well. The longer it simmered, the richer it became. Every bowl of Persian stew was a story. The ingredients told of trade: cinnamon from India, raisins from Bukhara, almonds from Samarkand, and honey from the oases of Kashgar. Even the humble lentil carried a history. First cultivated in Mesopotamia, it had crossed mountains and languages to end up in nearly every pot along the Silk Road. Persian merchants were also diplomats of flavour. Their food united travellers who might otherwise have drawn swords. The ritual was simple: bread torn by hand, dipped into the communal pot, and shared in silence. No one was left hungry, for to deny another food was to offend God. Hospitality was law, and a good cook could earn safe passage where soldiers could not. The Mongols, notorious for their rough diets of milk and mutton, adopted Persian stews after conquering the region. They called them soups of patience, food that taught stillness, simmering for hours as the world burned outside. Even the Chinese envoys who tasted them on their westward missions sent home notes about the red stews of Persia, fragrant and deep as poetry. When night fell over the desert, the last embers of the cooking fire glowed beneath iron pots. The stars above mirrored the pomegranate seeds below, small, bright, and eternal. On the Silk Road, Persian stew wasn't just sustenance. It was warmth, art, and diplomacy ladled into a single bowl. When the Mongols thundered onto the Silk Road in the 13th century, they brought not only conquest, but appetite. Their empire stretched from Korea to the Black Sea, and with it came a blending of flavours on an unprecedented scale. Yet at heart, Mongol cuisine remained loyal to the steppe, a diet built on what could walk, graze, or be milked. In the open plains of Mongolia, there were no vineyards, no olive groves, no spice gardens, only herds. Every animal was a pantry. Sheep, goats, and horses provided meat, milk, and fat. Cows gave butter, and camels gave both transportation and, occasionally, dinner. Meat was roasted on iron skewers, or boiled in water flavoured only by its own fat. To a Persian or Chinese merchant used to saffron and herbs, it might have seemed plain, but to a Mongol horseman it was perfection. Their most famous drink was airag, fermented mare's milk, tangy and mildly alcoholic. It was the beverage of conquerors, poured for guests in leather flasks and served as both refreshment and greeting. In colder months, Mongols made sute tsai, tea brewed with salt and yak butter, a strange mix that fueled armies through frost and fatigue. The Mongols valued efficiency over luxury. Food needed to travel easily and last long. Dried curds called arul were perfect for the road, rock-hard nuggets of milk that could last months without spoiling. Dried meat was another staple, thinly sliced, sun-cured, and ready to be boiled back into soup when needed. Theirs was a cuisine born of movement, and it marched as far as their empire did. But conquest changed the Mongol palate. As they absorbed Persia and China, they tasted refinement: stews thickened with flour, rice cooked with raisins and almonds, and breads soft as clouds. In their courts, cooks from every corner of the empire experimented together, creating what might be the first global menu. The Mongol table became a mirror of empire, simple at its roots yet vast in influence. It carried the fire of the steppes into the palaces of Baghdad and the tea-houses of Beijing, and when their empire finally fractured, the flavours they'd gathered refused to die. They lingered, stubborn as smoke on wool across the Silk Road for centuries to come. After days of heat and silence, the first sight of an oasis was enough to make a traveller weep. Palms shimmered in the distance like green flames, and the scent of water reached before the sound. For merchants trudging through the Taklamakan or the Syrian desert, these pockets of paradise were more than resting points. They were living kitchens where the Silk Road's flavours were born anew. Each oasis had its own character, defined by what grew there. In Kashgar, apricots the colour of sunset were dried into sheets of sweetness that could survive 1,000 miles of travel. In Bukhara, grapes became golden raisins that perfumed stews. In Samarkand, melons grew so fragrant that Chinese poets wrote verses about them. Even the humble date, carried from Arabia to the far edges of China, was a jewel of energy wrapped in sugar and legend. These oases were melting pots long before the phrase existed. Persian caravanners met Chinese spice traders, Indian monks, and Arab scholars. Around wells and shade trees, meals unfolded like ceremonies. Flatbread baked on clay walls was torn and dipped into bowls of lentils and yogurt. Sheep roasted slowly over open coals, their fat dripping into the sand, sending smoke into the night sky. Pots of sweet tea bubbled beside them, spiced with cardamom and poured into tiny cups with the reverence of prayer. Hospitality was sacred. Travellers could arrive penniless and still leave with full stomachs. To feed a stranger was to honour God. To deny food in the desert was to commit spiritual treason. And so, around every oasis fire, religion and language faded, replaced by laughter, bargaining, and the crunch of bread between teeth. Women of the oases often guarded culinary secrets. They mixed dates with sesame paste, rolled them in crushed nuts, and offered them to guests as tokens of peace. Some fermented camel milk into yogurt, others turned grains into porridge flavoured with honey and rosewater. When dawn returned, the caravans would rise again, bellies full and hearts lighter. The oasis faded behind them like a dream, a brief reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, life could be soft, sweet, and shared. The desert might starve the body, but the oasis fed the soul. Long before cafes and wine bars filled the cities of Europe, their spirits met on the Silk Road. Here, amid the smell of dust and cumin, Arab coffee beans clinked against amphorae of Greek wine, two drinks born from opposite worlds but united by one purpose: conversation. The Silk Road was not just about moving goods, it was about staying awake long enough to make deals, tell stories, and outlast the night. In the Arabian Peninsula, coffee was a revelation. Discovered by shepherds who noticed their goats dancing after eating red berries, it spread like wildfire through Yemen and Mecca, before finding its way north to the great markets of Damascus and Baghdad. Merchants called it kahwa, a word that once meant wine, and perhaps that was fitting because it stirred minds instead of dulling them. On the Silk Road, coffee was served black and strong, often brewed with cardamom or cloves in copper pots. It kept the caravans alert during long desert nights, its aroma mingling with the smoke of campfires and the soft hum of prayer. Meanwhile, in the Hellenistic and Persian worlds, wine remained the drink of civilization. Greek and Anatolian vintners shipped amphorae eastward, where wine was mixed with spices, cinnamon, saffron, and honey, to create exotic tonics for traders and nobles alike. The Persians, never ones to waste beauty, turned winemaking into poetry. Their poets compared red wine to rubies and reason alike, dangerous, intoxicating, and divine. When these two worlds met, the sober wisdom of coffee and the dreamlike haze of wine, something new happened. Markets buzzed with energy long after sunset. Contracts were signed, philosophies debated, and secrets traded over cups and goblets. The caffeine of Arabia met the vintage of the Aegean, fueling the world's first intellectual highway. By the late medieval period, coffee houses began to appear along the trade routes, in Damascus, Aleppo, and later Istanbul. They became the schools of the wise, where travellers and locals discussed everything from politics to poetry. In the end, coffee and wine mirrored the Silk Road itself, opposites that didn't clash but complemented each other. One sharpened the mind, the other softened the heart, both essential ingredients in the great recipe of civilization that the Silk Road continued to stir for centuries. When the caravans finally stopped and the Silk Road faded into history, its flavours did not vanish. They simply unpacked their bags and stayed behind. Every culture it touched kept a piece of the feast. From the dumpling shops of Xi'an to the spice bazaars of Istanbul, the road's spirit lived on, not in monuments or maps, but in kitchens. China's cuisine still carries whispers of Persia and Arabia. The scallion pancake, flaky and golden, likely descended from layered flatbreads once flipped on Persian griddles. The noodle soups of Lanzhou trace their ancestry to the meat broths of Central Asia. Even the word tea took two roads: cha through land, tea by sea, spreading flavour and language in equal measure. In the Middle East, traces of the East remain in every spice rack. Cardamom and cinnamon from India, cloves from the Maluku Islands, and sesame from China became inseparable from Arab and Persian kitchens. Dishes like pilaf and samsa, the ancestors of modern samosas, are proof that recipes travel faster than armies. What began as trade became tradition. In Europe, the legacy was equally profound. Venetian merchants imported not just silk, but sugar, dates, and almonds, forever changing Western desserts. Even pasta, the pride of Italy, owes something to those early travellers who carried the noodle westward. The Silk Road may have ended, but the dinner table became its permanent embassy. Modern globalization, for all its noise, merely echoes what the Silk Road achieved with camel bells and campfires. Today's sushi in Paris, kebab in New York, or coffee in Seoul is the same old story told with different spices, strangers sitting down to share warmth and curiosity through taste. More than goods or gold, it was food that proved the world could be connected by pleasure rather than conquest. A bowl of stew, a cup of tea, a shared loaf of bread, these were the real treaties of history. The road may have eroded, but its recipes endure, written not in ink, but in flavour. To eat anywhere today is to taste the Silk Road, the ghost of a meal passed from hand to hand, century to century, uniting empires long after the last caravan vanished beyond the dunes. For the Vikings, survival was an everyday negotiation with nature. Their world was carved from rock, ice, and sea, a place where summer was a rumour and winter the dominant season. In Scandinavia, the growing season barely lasted a few months, and the sea was both pantry and predator. To live here required foresight, discipline, and a deep understanding of how to cheat decay itself. The Vikings didn't just eat to live, they engineered survival through the art of preservation. In summer, the fjords came alive with activity. Men hauled in nets of cod, herring, and salmon, the ocean's true treasure. These catches weren't meant for the table, but for the future. Along the coast, fish racks called yell lined the cliffs, stretching like wooden ribs against the horizon. Here, the salt air and constant wind worked their quiet alchemy. The flesh dried slowly until it became stockfish, hard as wood, light as bone, and able to last for years. This dried fish would feed sailors, settlers, and raiders alike, sustaining them through voyages that reached Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Salt was another guardian of life, though it came at a price. Scandinavia had little of it, so Viking traders sailed south to the Frisian coasts, or even to England to barter for the white gold. Once back home, salt turned slaughter into strategy. Pork, beef, and seal meat were rubbed and packed into barrels, layered with fat and sealed tight. Buried underground or stored in cool huts, these barrels became the beating heart of every longhouse, a guarantee against the hunger months. But the Vikings were more than butchers and fishers. They were scientists of fermentation. Milk became skyer, a thick, sour cousin of yogurt, or surmjolk, tangy and slightly fizzy, packed with nutrients. Vegetables, scarce though they were chopped, brined, and left to transform into pickles that brightened the darkest winter meal. Even ale was a kind of preservation, liquid bread that kept safer than water, and then there was smoke, the Viking signature. In low, turf-roofed huts, alder wood burned slow and fragrant. Fish, mutton, and reindeer hung above the embers for days until coated in a golden protective crust. The result was both shield and seasoning, food that resisted time. The Vikings didn't cook for pleasure, they cooked to endure. And in mastering rot, wind, salt, and flame, they turned survival into an art form. If there was one preservation technique that defined Viking life, it was drying. The simplest, most natural, and most vital of all. Without it, the northern world would have starved. The air itself became their refrigerator, the wind their silent labourer. In a land where the sun never set in summer but refused to rise in winter, drying was the alchemy that turned fleeting abundance into endurance. During the brief fishing season, Viking coasts came alive. Boats returned heavy with cod, herring and salmon, their scales flashing like coins in the pale sun. The catch was cleaned, gutted, and hung by the tail on vast wooden racks called hjell, stretching for miles along the fjords. These skeletal structures became a familiar sight, rows of fish swinging gently in the breeze, guarded by gulls and the occasional hungry fox. The drying process was a delicate balance. The air had to be cold enough to prevent rot, yet dry enough to draw out moisture. Luckily, the Nordic climate, cold, windy, and low in humidity, was perfect. No fire, no salt, no magic, just time and patience. Within weeks, the fish would harden into stockfish, tough, pale, and nearly indestructible. When struck, it sounded like wood. When softened in water and boiled, it became nourishment dense enough to sustain voyages across the North Atlantic. Stockfish was more than food. It was currency. It could be traded for grain, salt, or weapons, and was prized from Norway to Constantinople. Its longevity made it the ideal export for Viking traders, who filled their ships with dried fish alongside amber and furs. In Iceland, hard fish, became so common that it replaced bread on many tables. Drying wasn't limited to fish. Meat, too, was cut thin, salted lightly if possible, and hung in the same winds. Even herbs, mushrooms, and berries were dried and stored in woven sacks, ensuring that something of summer could be tasted when snow sealed the earth. In a world without sugar or refrigeration, the Vikings mastered the art of letting the elements work for them. Drying was the quiet heartbeat of their survival, a pact between man and nature. The wind took their labour, and in return, it gave them life. If air was the Vikings' first ally, salt was their second, though far rarer and far more precious. In the harsh north, salt was not just a seasoning, it was power. It could turn meat into treasure and fish into fortune. Yet Scandinavia's cold coasts offered little in the way of natural salt pans, forcing the Norse to rely on trade, ingenuity, and the sea itself. Viking merchants understood early that control over salt meant control over survival. They imported it from the salt works of Frisia, Brittany, and northern Germany, hauling sacks of coarse, glittering crystals aboard their longships. Some settlements on Denmark's coasts experimented with their own production, boiling seawater over fires until only crusty white flakes remained. But it was expensive and fuel-hungry. For most Viking families, salt was used like gold dust, sprinkled sparingly and with reverence. Its purpose was not flavour, it was preservation. In late autumn, when livestock were slaughtered to avoid feeding them through winter, meat was sliced, layered with salt, and packed tightly into barrels or clay pots. The salt drew out moisture, creating a brine that locked decay at bay. Once sealed, the barrels were stored in cool, dark huts or buried beneath floors to escape the frost. When reopened months later, the contents were still edible, a small miracle in a world ruled by hunger. Fish too, especially herring, cod and mackerel, were treated this way. Salted fish became a Viking export almost as important as dried stockfish. It travelled south to markets in England, France, and even Byzantium, where it was considered a delicacy from the edge of the world. Salted butter and cheese, meanwhile, became everyday luxuries, traded within communities as symbols of prosperity. But the true genius of salt lay in its universality. It preserved meat for warriors, fish for sailors, and dairy for farmers. It turned perishable food into transportable wealth. The Vikings might not have understood microbiology, but they understood something deeper, that salt was both life and loyalty. To waste it was to court famine. To hoard it was to command respect. In the sagas, heroes sought glory, gold, and land. But in the quiet corners of Viking homesteads, the real victories were sealed in barrels of salted flesh that kept death waiting just a little longer. If drying was the Vikings' whisper and salt their secret, then smoke was their song, the rich, fragrant heartbeat of northern preservation. Long before ovens or spices softened food's edge, smoke was both tool and shield. It flavoured, hardened, and sanctified what the Vikings hunted and fished. In the north, fire didn't just warm homes, it built time itself, allowing meat to last through months of darkness. The process began in a simple hut, the elders or smokehouse. Inside, a low fire burned slowly, fed with damp wood from alder, birch, or juniper. No roaring flames, no bright light, just smouldering embers producing thick, aromatic smoke. Above the fire, poles were fixed where meat and fish hung like offerings. Over hours, days, and sometimes weeks, the smoke wrapped every piece in a cloak of flavour and protection. Fish was the favourite canvas for this art. Herring, cod, and salmon, abundant in the northern seas, were brined lightly, then suspended over the fire until they darkened into glossy amber. The result was rooked fisk, smoky, chewy, and resistant to decay. For the Vikings, it was the perfect travel food, lightweight, portable, and nourishing even after long voyages. Meat followed the same ritual. Pork bellies, mutton legs, and even game like reindeer and seal were smoked until firm and aromatic. The smoke infused not only flavour, but safety, keeping insects and mould at bay in humid coastal air. Sometimes, the meat was smoked so heavily that it could last for years, softening again only after soaking and boiling. The smell of a Viking settlement was unmistakable, salt, sea, and smoke mingling into a scent of defiance against nature. Inside the longhouse, soot-blackened beams bore witness to countless winters survived on smoked fare. Children grew up with it, warriors packed it, and sailors carried it across oceans. Even dairy joined the ritual. Cheese and butter, when smoked, acquired a nutty sharpness that elevated humble meals. The Vikings may not have known the chemistry behind it, but they understood its poetry, that smoke turned perishability into permanence. To them, the curling wisps rising from the fire were not just preservation, they were prayers. Prayers that their food would last, their ships would return, and their world, harsh as it was, would always have the smell of life lingering in the air. Fermentation was the Vikings' quiet miracle, a science born from necessity and instinct. In a land where freezing winds and fleeting summers ruled, the Vikings learned to harness time, rot, and bacteria to transform perishable food into long-lasting sustenance. It was survival through controlled decay, and it worked beautifully. Milk, the most abundant and fragile food of all, became the centerpiece of Viking fermentation. Fresh milk spoiled within days, but when left in cool clay jars or animal skin bags, it soured naturally. The result was surmjölk, sour milk that could last for weeks and tasted sharp and invigorating. With a bit of patience and stirring, it became skyr, a thick, protein-rich cousin to yogurt that filled bellies and fueled voyages. It was so nutritious that even warriors carried it aboard their ships, packed in wooden tubs. The same philosophy applied to vegetables, though these were rarer in the north. Cabbage, onions, and wild greens were chopped, salted, and submerged in brine. Weeks later, they emerged as pickled relishes bursting with acidity and life. These fermented vegetables replenished nutrients lost during long winters and added flavour to otherwise monotonous meals of fish and meat. It was, unknowingly, a stroke of nutritional genius. Even grains and drinks were not exempt from fermentation's touch. Barley became ale, a liquid staple safer to drink than water. Honey transformed into mjød, a golden, lightly alcoholic drink reserved for feasts and rituals. The Vikings might not have understood yeast, but they understood magic, that nature could turn something humble into something powerful. Fermentation was also a matter of culture, quite literally. Every household maintained its own microbial signature. The sour milk in one longhouse might taste entirely different from that of a neighbouring farm, shaped by the local air, soil, and even the wood of the storage barrels. What modern scientists call probiotics, the Vikings simply called life. There was wisdom in their rot. Fermentation demanded patience, faith, and respect for nature's invisible helpers. In every bubbling pot or sour jar, the Vikings found proof that decay could sustain, not destroy. They had discovered that preservation wasn't about defeating nature, it was about partnering with it. And in that partnership, they thrived where few others could. When the first frost touched the fjords, Viking life shifted from harvest to hibernation. Winter wasn't a season. It was an adversary. Everything that wasn't preserved, stored, or sealed would vanish under ice and darkness. And so, long before the snow arrived, Viking households transformed into workshops of survival, where barrels, jars, and pits became as important as swords and sails. The Viking barrel was an engineering marvel. Crafted from oak or pine staves bound with iron hoops, it was airtight, portable, and nearly indestructible. These barrels were used to store everything: salted meat, smoked fish, butter, ale, and even fermenting cabbage. Each longhouse had a storeroom, cool and dim, often dug partly into the earth. There, barrels lined the walls like sentinels, their contents preserving not just calories, but hope. Salted pork and beef rested in brine so dense that nothing could spoil it. Layers of fat and wax sealed the surface to keep out air. Nearby, smaller barrels held pickled vegetables, shredded cabbage, turnips, or wild onions steeped in sour liquid that kept scurvy at bay through the long dark. Dairy, too, found its place in storage. Butter was clarified into smør, packed tightly, and buried in cool ground to harden like gold. Every Viking winter was a countdown. Families measured the season by how full or empty the storage barrels became. A cracked lid or leaking brine could mean hunger by February. It was a delicate system, built on vigilance and tradition. Every generation refining the craft, every meal a testament to last summer's labour. Even beverages were preserved in barrels. Ale and mead were brewed in autumn, sealed tightly, and stored until Yule. In the dead of winter, when storms howled outside and the hearth glowed low, these drinks were shared in celebration, a small rebellion against the season's cruelty. Barrels also made trade possible. Salted fish, cured meats and butter could travel across seas, sustaining armies and settlers alike. They were the Viking equivalent of refrigeration, wooden time capsules that captured summer's bounty and released it, slowly, through the cold months. In the end, these humble containers did more than store food. They stored life itself. Without the barrel, there would have been no voyages, no settlements, and perhaps no Vikings at all. While the rest of Europe salted or smoked its food, the Vikings took preservation one step further. They embraced sourness. Pickling and brining were their culinary magic, a chemistry of salt, water, and patience that turned fragile vegetables and meats into tangy powerhouses of nutrition. To the Vikings, sour meant safe. And safety, in a frozen world, was flavour. Vegetables were rare prizes in the north, so every scrap counted. When autumn came, women and thralls worked feverishly to slice cabbage, onions, turnips, and wild herbs into thin ribbons. These were packed into clay jars or wooden tubs, layered with salt and water, and weighed down with stones. Over the weeks, nature took over. The vegetables fermented, releasing lactic acid that warded off rot. What emerged was surkal, a Viking ancestor of sauerkraut, crisp, sharp, and full of life even when snow buried the world outside. The process wasn't limited to plants. Meat, fish, and even eggs found new life in brine. Herring was submerged in barrels of vinegar and salt water, sometimes spiced with dill, juniper berries, or mustard seeds if trade goods allowed. The result was not only edible, but invigorating. Food that could travel long distances without spoiling. Viking sailors often brought barrels of pickled fish on voyages, knowing the sour tang would revive appetites when salted meat grew dull. Even dairy joined the acidic tradition. Leftover whey from cheesemaking was reused to ferment vegetables or steep meat, giving it a tart edge that modern palates would recognize as uniquely Nordic. The Vikings didn't know it, but they were practicing probiotic preservation, using good bacteria to fight bad ones long before science caught up. In the longhouses, the scent of pickling was as familiar as smoke. clay jars lined the walls beside barrels of ale and dried fish, their bubbling contents softly hissing as they transformed. It was a smell of security, a promise that, come the dark months, there would still be something fresh, crisp, and sour to awaken the tongue. The Viking love of sour flavours still echoes today in Scandinavian cuisine, from pickled herring to fermented milk and rye bread with a tangy bite. Long before refrigeration, the Vikings mastered the art of turning decay into renewal. Proof that even in a brutal climate, life could still be deliciously alive. For all their skill at storing and rationing food, the Vikings were not joyless eaters. When the harvest came in or a raid returned heavy with spoils, the longhouses erupted into celebration. Preservation wasn't just about survival. It was about abundance made visible. Every smoked ham, every barrel of mead, every wheel of aged cheese represented victory over time. A feast was proof that their methods had worked, that the gods had favoured their craft. At these gatherings, the longhouse became a glowing cathedral of warmth. Torches flickered against carved beams blackened by years of smoke. The air filled with the mingled scents of meat, fat, and honey. Tables, rough planks laid over barrels, groaned under platters of roasted pork, smoked salmon, salted lamb, and pickled vegetables. There was no delicate plating here. Everything came in portions fit for giants. The cooks, often women or thralls, used preserved ingredients like artists using pigments. Dried cod was soaked and stewed with onions and butter. Smoked meat was sliced thin and layered over flatbread. Sour milk became drink or sauce, mixed with herbs and salt. Even the simplest dish carried the memory of the labour that had made it possible: fishing, salting, drying, fermenting, waiting. At the centre of every feast was mead, honey fermented into liquid sunlight. It was poured endlessly, foaming and golden, into wooden cups that passed from hand to hand. Mead bound the feast together, loosening tongues and kindling stories. Warriors boasted of battles, traders bragged of distant ports, and skalds, the poets, recited sagas between gulps. To drink was not mere indulgence, it was communion, a ritual acknowledgement that life had once again endured the elements. Music and laughter filled the hall, echoing through the dark countryside. Outside, the world froze and howled, but inside there was heat, noise, and survival turned into celebration. When food preservation was a matter of life and death, a feast was an act of defiance. A reminder that even in the cruel north, the Vikings could not only endure, but thrive. These moments were brief, but their meaning lingered. Each feast was a cycle completed, a reward earned through labour and patience. The Vikings didn't feast despite hardship. They feasted because of it. Preservation, after all, wasn't just about saving food. It was about saving joy for when the world needed it most. When the Viking Age faded into legend, their ships rotted and their kingdoms crumbled, but their foodways endured. The preservation methods they perfected in fjords and frozen fields became the DNA of Scandinavian cuisine. Long after the raids stopped, the drying racks, smokehouses, and sour barrels remained, shaping how entire nations ate, traded, and thought about survival. In Norway, the art of drying fish still reigns supreme. Along the northern coast, wooden racks heavy with cod stand against the sea wind exactly as they did 1,000 years ago. The product, stockfish, is still exported worldwide, its preparation nearly unchanged since the days of Leif Erikson. In Iceland, hardfiska is a national snack, eaten with butter and pride, a direct link to the Viking past. Each bite is history you can chew. Sweden and Denmark carried forward the Viking love of pickling and fermenting. Modern surströmming, the notorious fermented herring, is the wild descendant of Viking brine barrels. Its pungent aroma is both a punchline and a point of heritage, a reminder that sourness once meant survival. Scandinavian chefs today, from Copenhagen to Oslo, still chase that same balance of salt, acid, and smoke, proof that ancient necessity became timeless flavour. Even the Viking barrel has descendants. The use of wooden casks to age beer, ferment wine, and store food spread across Europe through Norse trade routes. The Vikings didn't invent the barrel, but they weaponized it, turning it into a tool that let them carry their world wherever they sailed. The same technology that preserved cod and pork would one day preserve whiskey and wine. Their legacy also lived through health. Without knowing the words probiotic or nutrition, the Vikings developed diets rich in bacteria and minerals that protected them from disease and scurvy. The fermented cabbage, sour milk, and salted fish that kept them alive in winter are now recognized as dietary powerhouses, ancestral forms of what we call superfoods. To modernize, Viking cuisine may look harsh, a landscape of dried, sour, and salted things. Yet within that harshness lies genius, a cuisine built to outlast death itself. The Vikings learned not to fight their climate, but to adapt to it, to make preservation not just a method, but a mindset. And that mindset, like the smoke of their hearths, still lingers over the North Sea.